อไม่นานวันนี้ไทย PBS ได้มีโอกาสเป็นเจ้าภาพจัดการประชุมสุดยอดสื่อสารมวลชนในเอเชียและแปซิฟิกเอเชียมีเดียซัมมิต 2012 นะคะมีบุคลากรในวงการสื่อสารมวลชนมาร่วมงานกันด้วยมากมายนะคะที่เป็นระดับโลกหนึ่งในนั้นก็คือลอร์ดวิลเลียมส์แห่งบัคลันค่ะซึ่งเป็นหนึ่งในกรรมการนโยบายของ BBC มาพูดคุยนะคะถึงความเป็นสื่อสาธารณะรวมถึงวิเคราะห์การเมืองในระดับภูมิภาคด้วยค่ะโดยลอร์ดวิลเลียมส์นะคะได้รับการแต่งตั้งเป็นกรรมการนโยบายของ BBC เมื่อวันที่ 1 ธันวาคมปีที่แล้วนะคะก่อนหน้านั้นมีบทบาทสำคัญในด้านความสัมพันธ์ระหว่างประเทศเคยได้รับการแต่งตั้งเป็นผู้ประสานงานพิเศษของสหประชาชาติด้านเลบานอนเป็นอดีตที่ปรึกษาให้อดีตรัฐมนตรีกระทรวงการต่างประเทศของอังกฤษ2 ท่านเป็นที่ปรึกษาพิเศษให้เลขาธิการสหประชาชาติด้านตะวันออกกลางและเป็นอดีตบรรณาธิการของ BBC ภาคบริการโลกล่าสุดได้รับการแต่งตั้งเป็นหนึ่งในกรรมการนโยบายของ BBC ลอร์ดวิลเลียมส์ในฐานะที่ได้รับการแต่งตั้งเป็นกรรมการนโยบายของ BBC มีหน้าที่ดูแลการทำงานของ BBC ภาคบริการสาธารณะระดับระหว่างประเทศก็คือ BBC ภาคบริการโลก BBC World News และ BBC Monitoring นะคะในความเป็นผู้บริหารระดับสูงของสื่อสาธารณะอย่าง BBC ที่ได้รับการยอมรับไปทั่วโลกจึงน่าสนใจนะคะว่าBBC จะมีแนวทางปรับตัวอย่างไรกับความเป็นสื่อสาธารณะในยุคที่บทบาทของสื่อกำลังถูกตั้งคำถามค่ะนอกจากบทบาทของสื่อสาธารณะในยุคนี้แล้วนะคะดิฉันก็ได้สอบถามลอร์ดวิลเลียมส์ด้วยว่าขอให้วิเคราะห์เรื่องของการเมืองในระดับภูมิภาคในเอเชียตะวันออกเฉียงใต้นะคะที่กำลังเปลี่ยนแปลงไปค่ะLord Williams, you have visited Bangkok many times, Thailand many times. I'm just wondering, every time you come to Thailand, have you tuned in the BBC as your first choice?
Always. I mean, I'm afraid I'm a creature of habit. In Bangkok, as in any other capital, I always tune in to the BBC.
Always the first channel?
Yeah, I can't help it. I apologize. But it's partly because, well, now I'm on the board of the trust of the BBC, but I also worked for the BBC for 8 years. This was from 1984 to 92. Then subsequently I worked for the United Nations. I worked with Mr. Kofi Annan, who's now trying to bring peace to Syria. But once Mr. Annan said that the BBC was Britain's biggest gift to the world. And
what a high compliment.
Exactly. It's something that an Englishman could not say, but coming from somebody who's not British, who's Ghanaian, and somebody who was Secretary General for the United Nations, it's a mark of real respect. And I think the BBC is one of the best things that have come out of Great Britain.
At high level of management at the BBC, what do you see the role of the BBC in this region, in Asia Pacific?
Well, first of all, I think the BBC is now 90 years old. I mean, it's sort of one of the oldest.
Really long life.
Exactly. Go back into 1922. One of the oldest broadcasters. But the BBC has always evolved, starting in radio, the first to go into television. In the mid-30s, and now really embracing online and mobile devices and all the rest of it. I think the BBC recognizes that ASEAN, Southeast Asia, East Asia is a very important part of the globe. And my visit here, in a way, is a small part of recognition of that fact. We're delighted by the success of PBS here in Thailand, and I think we see it as a sort of brother or sister organization, and your own commitment to public service broadcasting. But generally there's also a recognition of the extraordinary economic and social and political developments in Thailand, in Southeast Asia, and in the wider Asia region. And the BBC wants to be part of that, to reflect to the British public, to inform them of the developments here, but also through its global links, the World Service and World News, to report back to Asia, but also to report Asia to the rest of the world.
But the situation of the competition among international channels in Asia Pacific is quite fierce. You see CNN, you see Al Jazeera, you see BBC, CCTV English channel is also coming. Who are your main competitor?
Gosh, I mean, those are all competitors, and what's happening in broadcasting is not that much different from other industries, in the sense that in all sectors of the economy now, whether you're talking about making shoes or cars or broadcasting, competition is intense. And if you're going to succeed, you always have to bring something different. And I mean, all the broadcasters you mentioned, from Al Jazeera, for example, which has made a big impact, first of all in the Arab world, but now strikingly in the non-Arab world too. I mean, I know friends in the UK who've never been to the Middle East, but that's one of the channels they now watch.
So it's the same battleground with the BBC?
It's kind of the same battleground, but I still think that the BBC has an immense amount to offer.
What's the strength of the BBC?
Gosh, well, for me, particularly in news and current affairs, I believe that there's a relentless research for objective journalism, and a journalism which deals with the UK, with Europe, and with the wider world. I mean, just to give an example, last week there was a bomb explosion which killed many people in Yemen. Now that led the news, not on world news, but on BBC domestic news, the main bulletin at 10 o'clock. Now that would never have happened in the United States or in France, unless many of their civilians had been killed.
You mean editorial standards, the judgment is different?
The editorial judgment is different, and I think it's unique. And
BBC is more open?
Yes.
Is that what you mean?
Exactly, more open, and I think more objective. I mean, the United States is a country, for example, for which I have enormous respect. But I mean, I would never watch television in the United States for news or for entertainment. I mean, I read American newspapers. I think the New York Times is one of the best papers in the world. But it's not just in news and current affairs, but I think drama, for example, is something where the BBC is still the global leader.
Yes, BBC has a lot to offer, and as you said, it has existed for 90 years.
Correct.
And it tends to be a top role model when people look at public broadcasting service. How can it survive for so long? Do you think BBC is still highly relevant in British society?
Yes, without doubt. And in fact, this is something that we discuss quite often on the BBC board, on the BBC Trust. And the respect for the BBC within the UK is higher than ever.
Nowadays?
Yes. And many of the commercial channels find it quite difficult in many areas. For example, local journalism, if we're talking about Scotland or the west of England, it's only the BBC that does that in a very thorough way. Drama, if you're looking at the works of Shakespeare or Charles Dickens, or series like Doctor Who and Sherlock Holmes and so on, there's no competition with the BBC in the UK or in Europe. Because
not Sky News, not Channel 4.
No. Sky News can do sport and it can do news, but it cannot be all round in the way that the BBC is. And I think there are very deep traditions within the BBC and a skill set which is very strong, whether you're talking about the journalists who are doing the news, or you're talking about producers of drama and of classical music, or for that matter, rock music and contemporary drama. I think the BBC traditionally still attracts the very best talent in the UK.
But the BBC been through a lot. You have
Sure.
faced fixed budget, frozen of the budget, and then you have to lay off quite a number of good people,
Yeah.
cost cutting.
Yeah.
How the BBC has adapted to different situations through different times.
Yeah. I mean, the short answer is with difficulty. I mean, all these changes are tough. And frankly, in the past year, it's been very difficult on the board, trying to choose between where are the areas that you are going to invest and mature and grow, and where can you make some cuts. And we've had some quite painful discussions and decisions to make. But I'm confident that through the way that we fund the BBC, which is a sort of tax, what we call a license fee,
Yes.
on every home in the UK, that still gives the BBC its independence and a body of funding which still enables us to do the vast amount of what we want to achieve. And there's no area that we're not present in. I mean, I've talked a lot about news and current affairs as partly my own interests, but sport, for example, or drama, light entertainment, music of all sorts. The BBC is present in each of these fields.
Given that current circumstance of the media in the whole world is changing so rapidly with the coming of the social media with its influential role, how do you see the role of public broadcasting service in global society?
I mean, that's a very good question and one that's extremely difficult to answer, because now it seems to me the speed of change has become so fast. Speed of change in itself has accelerated. Radio started around 1920, and then already in the late 1930s you had the first experiments with television. It was the 1960s before we had color television, and then some years again before we had sort of global television through the use of satellites. Now we have online and what you were referring to just now, social media. I still see a place for public broadcasting, and I think it's for us as public broadcasters, whether the BBC or you as PBS, you have to be inventive all the time to try and stay ahead of the curve. Although I would recognize that I think that's becoming more difficult rather than less difficult in the coming period.
So what would be your recommendation for the Thai PBS as we have just been born for 4 years?
Well, of course, you're a real presence on television, on the landscape of television in Thailand. I understand that you have plans to move into radio as well. And that's very interesting, because I think all of us now, for information, for entertainment, for education, we use a variety of media. I mean, I always start my day with radio, and then I would go soon after that to internet. I would only watch television in the evening. So we're all doing different things, and they're not incompatible. And I think for public broadcasters, you have to be present in the old fields, if you like, the old, like radio, which still has a huge audience in the UK, but also online and increasingly in the social media.
At least 3 things at the same time: TV, radio, online.
For me, that's enough. But I mean, the market will, I suspect, go further.
Talking about radio service and what have been going on inside Burma, do you think the contribution of World Service, Burmese service section, is part of the pushing of political reform in Burma?
A short answer, yes.
To what extent?
That's more difficult to judge. The BBC's Burmese service, but also its English language service, has reached so many people, not just over the past years, but over past decades. It's quite unimaginable. I mean, the first time I went to Burma was in 1989, which was only a year after the tragedy of the student demonstrations in '88 and so on. But the reach of the BBC then, I mean, there were times of the day when the BBC was on air when people simply wouldn't be around because they would be at home listening. And I think that's been sustained. And Aung San Suu Kyi herself has often spoken to this. And earlier I had a very good meeting with the Burmese information minister, and he too recognized the role historically the BBC has played in Myanmar, and I hope that it will continue to do so.
But seeing political reform happening in Burma, is Burmese section will be no longer valid in the near future?
I think, you know, the process of reform will take time. I'm very encouraged by what I've seen happening, and I'm looking forward to visiting in a few days to get a feel of the pulse locally. But I think it may well be, and we've discussed this with the minister, that BBC can also play a supportive role in helping to train a younger generation of Burmese journalists and helping to improve the technical skills of Burma's own national broadcaster. So I suspect there will always be a role for the Burmese service.
As you can see now, protest is going on inside Burma in some provinces like Mandalay in Yangon. Do you feel that the haunt of saffron revolution in 2007 will come back? Do you think the reform will be reversible in Burma?
You know, one can never say no, but personally I feel quite confident, and even more so because of the conversations I had a few hours ago with the minister. I feel a process is underway. I've had the privilege myself to meet with the President, Thein Sein, and I went with the United Nations after the awful tragedy of Cyclone Nargis in 2008. And I felt even then that this was a sort of emerging Burmese government. I mean, it was asking for international assistance to cope with this terrible tragedy, whereas in the past, Burma perhaps might not have done that. But it's spectacular to see, you know, our British Foreign Minister William Hague go, David Cameron, our Prime Minister, Hillary Clinton, ministers from France and Germany. Now we have the Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh there. And I think this is a global recognition that Burma wants to change, and by the outside world, the support and the conviction that we want to try and help in a constructive and positive manner.
Counting down to ASEAN community in 2015. But at the same time, we are looking at EU, European Union, as one of the role model in many aspects. But EU is now facing financial crisis, so many trouble internally among EU countries. What should be the lesson for ASEAN countries?
That's tough. First of all, I would say good luck. It's not, ASEAN has worked very well. Now in 2015, you're entering a new phase. And of course, within ASEAN, there are many differences. Differences of language, for example, which we have in Europe, but also different levels of development. We just talked about Burma and so on. But when you compare Burma, for example, with Singapore, I know Singapore is only as a city-state, that's a huge difference. Nevertheless, I think ASEAN is at the stage whether there should be more economic assistance. Speaking personally, I think one of the steps which perhaps in Europe we did not think through was the question of the European currency, the euro. Now, Britain did not join that. We keep the pound. But we see in Europe many problems because of having a common currency. Because history teaches us you can only have a common currency if you have a common political domain. And although we have the European Union, we still have national governments. So I think and hope 2015 will go well for ASEAN. I think it's important. And it's important for Southeast Asia globally. You will play a bigger role. But I think my recommendation would be don't move too fast. One of the things that Europe did after 1989 and the collapse of Eastern Europe, of the communist regimes, is that we then moved very, very quickly. And I think in retrospect that move was far too fast.
Thank you, Lord William, for joining me in ตอบโจทย์
My pleasure.
สวัสดีค่ะ